Meeting number 113 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development. Before we begin, I'd like to ask all members and other in-person participants to consult the cards on the table for guidelines to prevent audio feedback incidents. Only use the black earpieces. Keep your earpieces away from all microphones at all times. And when you are not using your earpiece, please face it down on the sticker placed on the table for this purpose. Now, today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format. I'd like to make a few comments for the benefit of our distinguished witnesses as well as the members. Before speaking, please do wait until I recognize you by name. You may speak in the official language of your choice. Interpretation services are available. In accordance with the committee's routine motion concerning connection tests for witnesses, I've been assured by the clerk that she has very kindly made sure that the test with all witnesses who are joining us virtually has been completed. Now, I should start off by apologizing to the witnesses. Apologies that we had a number of votes, so that has changed the schedule somewhat today. But we're very, very grateful that you could join us. Now, pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by committee on Thursday, February 16th, 2023, the committee will resume its study of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and the current situation in Iran. And of course, as everyone is aware, today, to the extent possible, we're going to keep the focus on the IRGC and what it does beyond the borders of Iran. So that all having been explained, it's a great pleasure to welcome today Dr. Mahmoud Amiri Moghadam, who is a professor and is the head of the Iran Human Rights Center. Here in person, we're grateful to have Professor Thomas Journeau, a professor with the Department of Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa, who's familiar to you all. And also joining us virtually, we have Professor Pierre Pahlavi, who's with the Canadian Forces College. So each of you will be provided 5 minutes for your opening remarks, after which we will open it to questions by the members. However, I would ask that every once in a while you do look up. If this is up, that means you should be trying to put an end to whatever you're saying within 10 to 15 seconds, because each member is only allotted a specific time as well. So all of that having been explained, we will start off with Professor Amiri Moghadam. You have 5 minutes and the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me, ladies and gentlemen. So as it was said, I'm director of the organization Iran Human Rights. Iran Human Rights has been monitoring and reporting human rights violations in Iran in the last 17 years, with a particular emphasis on the death penalty. The imposition of the death penalty serves as a critical indicator of the human rights situation and remains the primary tool employed by the Islamic Republic to sow fear within society. Following the nationwide Women Life Freedom protests, the regime has been executing an alarming average of 2 to 3 individuals every single day. Iran Human Rights documented a staggering 834 executions in Iran last year alone, with 8 of those individuals being protesters. The execution of protesters sparked an international outcry and escalated the political cost of imposing death sentences on protesters for the Islamic Republic. However, the majority of executions are for drug-related offenses. At least 471 executions for drugs in 2023. Regrettably, the global community has largely turned a blind eye to drug executions, failing to condemn these grave violations of human rights. Even more concerning is the complicity of the United Nations Office for Drugs and Crimes, UNODC, which not only remained silent in the face of this surge in executions, but proceeded to sign a new cooperation agreement with the Iranian authorities. These executions are not aimed at combating drug trafficking, but rather serve as a ruthless tactic to instill fear and deter future protests. Individuals sentenced to death for drug offenses are deprived of legal representation and a fair judicial process by the revolutionary courts, particularly impacting marginalized and impoverished segments of Iranian society. Ethnic minorities, notably the Baluchi minority, are disproportionately represented among those executed, serving as the low-cost victims of the Islamic Republic's killing machine. Compounding these injustices is the compelling evidence that implicates Iranian authorities and the IRGC in collusion with the international drug cartels. Notably, a renowned terrorism expert has highlighted drug trafficking as one of the main sources of income for the IRGC, underscoring the illicit nature of their operations. In 2012, the U.S. Department of Treasury designated IRGC Quds Force General Gholam Reza Baghbani as a specially designated narcotics trafficker under the Foreign Narcotics Kingpin Designation Act, shedding light on the deep-rooted ties between the IRGC and drug trafficking networks. The collaboration between the IRGC and international criminal cartels extends beyond drug trafficking and money laundering to include the reprehensible practice of abducting opposition members. This partnership was exemplified in the case of Habib Chab, a Swedish citizen and member of an Iranian Arab opposition group. In October 2020, Chab was abducted by the IRGC in collusion with international criminal networks while visiting Turkey. Subsequently, he was transferred to Iran, subjected to a sham trial by the Revolutionary Court, and ultimately executed in May 2023. Similarly, Ruhollah Zam, a prominent Iranian journalist and political activist, fell victim to the IRGC campaign of terror when he was abducted in 2019 during a visit to Iraq and subsequently hanged a year later. Jamshid Sharmat, a German citizen with U.S. residency, faced a similar fate after being abducted while in the United Arab Emirates in 2020, forcibly transferred to Iran and handed a death sentence. He remains under the imminent threat of execution. The IRGC and the Islamic Republic have not only rendered neighboring countries insecure, but have also orchestrated a series of terrorist attacks targeting Iranian dissidents on foreign soil, notably in Europe. One notable incident occurred in 2018 during an Iranian opposition gathering outside Paris, where a foiled terrorist plot implicated an Islamic Republic diplomat with ties to the IRGC. Subsequently, a Belgian court sentenced the diplomat to 20 years in prison for terrorism charges, underscoring the extent of the Islamic Republic's global reach and its willingness to resort to terrorism to suppress dissent. These acts of terrorism perpetrated by the Islamic Republic and its ideological arm, the IRGC, are not confined to Iranian dissidents, but extend to non-Iranian individuals worldwide, posing a grave threat to global security and stability. It is crucial to underscore that the Iranian people have been the main victims of the Islamic Republic and the IRGC's oppressive regime over the past 4.5 decades. From the brutal mass killings of dissidents...
Professor Amin Mohattam, you're a minute over. Are you going to be concluding in the next 20, 30 seconds?
Just
Thank you.
20 seconds, right. Just as the world now condemns the atrocities committed by the SS under the Nazi regime, future generations will look back on our IRGC with the same contempt and horror. The Iranian people are crying for justice and freedom and for solidarity. They need international community to stand with them in their struggle against oppression. By designating IRGC as a terrorist organization, Canada can send a clear and powerful message of support to Iranian people. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Amri Moghadam. We now turn to Professor Junot. You have 5 minutes, and the floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup. Ça me fait plaisir d'être là aujourd'hui.
I'm very pleased to be here with you today.
Canada does not do enough to counter IRGC activities inside the country here. Committee members, I think, are well aware of the nature of IRGC activities, especially in terms of transnational repression, the presence of senior regime members or their families, the parking of financial assets, and so on. To better counter IRGC activities in Canada, a combination of targeted measures should be the way forward. I understand the symbolic politics of listing the IRGC as a terrorist entity under the criminal code. I'm especially sensitive to pleas from victims of IRGC repression or brutality and from family members of victims. But the most ethical response to the IRGC's activities here is an effective one, a response that targets those doing the most harm and that best protects the victims. To situate my thinking, I would emphasize that I don't view this issue through a specifically Iran lens, but through the broader prisms of Canada's overall national security priorities and policies. This broader perspective emphasizes two factors. One, Canada faces a deteriorating security environment today, with multiple and intensifying threats. IRGC activities represent one of these threats, but not the only one, and I would say not the top one. Also, our security and intelligence agencies today are vastly overstretched and under-resourced. So that's the broader context. Listing the IRGC as a terrorist entity under the criminal code would be very labor-intensive. There are hundreds of thousands of current and former members. Enforcing this would be very demanding for law enforcement and national security agencies. It also raises the risk that innocents can be caught in the sweeping net of broad sanctions. This has become a serious problem in the U.S. To counter this problem, several people will suggest exemptions, whereby only those, for example, with blood on their hands or above a certain rank would be sanctioned. This is appealing in theory, but in practice further increases the workload of already overstretched agencies. This is a serious problem, even if it's one that is easy to dismiss. Canada already cannot fulfill our existing commitments to monitor and enforce sanctions, let alone current sanctions, let alone new ones. It is important to emphasize how much this irritates our allies, an increasingly serious problem that we underestimate, and one that goes beyond only sanctions to national security and defense in general. It also sends a message to adversaries that we are not serious about penalizing them, that we only care about the domestic politics of it, but not about actually enforcing concrete measures. In the reality of scarce resources that we live in, proponents of listing the IRGC should therefore explain which threats our national security agencies should stop focusing on as they redirect energies towards managing the listing of the IRGC, and how this overall would make Canada more secure. Proponents often answer by suggesting that the government should simply increase the resources of national security and law enforcement agencies. This is valid in general terms, but does not support the argument in practice. IRGC activities are only one of the many threats that our national security agencies struggle to counter. It is not clear why eventual additional resources should be targeted at the IRGC, as opposed to what I think are the bigger threats coming in particular from China and several others. I would also add that my colleagues who are lawyers question the lawfulness of listing the IRGC, which is the armed forces of a state, on a list that is meant for non-state actors. Not being a lawyer myself, I'm not in a position to expand on this point, but I would encourage the committee to look further into it. My suggestion to the committee, as we try to find the most effective way to better counter IRGC activities in Canada, is to focus on targeted measures, more specifically on 5 initiatives. 1, fully implement and enforce measures that we have already adopted, notably under the Special Economic Measures Act and the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, which, as I said, we are not fully enforcing as it is. 2, consider adding more individuals and entities under CIMA and IRPA and making greater use of other tools, such as corruption investigations. We could also better target Hezbollah financial networks here in Canada. The reality is that we are not fully exploiting the more surgical tools at our disposal. 3, to do that, we do need to provide our national security, intelligence, and law enforcement agencies and departments with more resources to enforce and monitor sanctions. And I cannot emphasize enough how badly overstretched they currently are. 4, we could also improve coordination and information sharing among the many departments and agencies involved in the development and enforcement of sanctions. And 5, and I will finish on this, we could also enhance transparency on sanctions and their enforcement. This would allow for more accountability and better scrutiny by civil society, by parliament, by the media, including of the fact that we are a poor performer on the sanctions enforcement front. We also need to be more transparent about what we aim to achieve with sanction and whether we are achieving it or not. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Journeau. We now turn to Professor Pahlavi. You have 5 minutes.
Bonjour, bonsoir à tout le monde et merci pour...
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak about an important issue to the Standing Committee. I would like to start where my colleague has just stopped, being the idea that the concept of terrorism does not necessarily apply to the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps. It's a vague concept. I'm not learning anything new by saying that there's no consensual definition at the United Nations. It's more a political concept than a scientific concept. However, there is still an intuitive understanding of what a terrorist organization is. It's an organization that uses violence and fear to achieve political objectives by using means that are mostly illicit or illegal. So if we take this definition, even though it's imperfect, the IRGC corresponds or does meet many of these criteria, which leads me to think that it is a terrorist organization, even if it's not a non-state organization. First of all, it's a violent and illicit organization that uses illicit and illegal means in its practice. Its involvement in the Iranian ballistic program and the Iranian nuclear program that have been sanctioned by the international community make this organization already an illicit and illegal organization. The IRGC controls an important part of the Iranian economy and uses this power to fund illegal operations. So from that point of view, there is one criterion that's satisfied. And it's a brutal and arbitrary organization that has recourse to indiscriminate violence. It has been accused many times for many years of violating human rights, and Dr. Amiri has reminded us of that. This court does not hesitate to practice torture and systematic rape against women when they're arrested and brought to jail. Also surveillance, intimidation, bullying, physical violence, detention. All these things make us think that the weapon of choice for the organization is terror and psychological pressure. It's also a subversive organization that uses ideological means to achieve political objectives. And when it acts outside of Iran's borders, it works to bring power down or to promote some non-state actors for the acquisition and for taking power. They could be the Houthis in Yemen or Hamas in Palestine. So it acts by supporting internal repression or contributing through the Al-Quds Corps or Brigade. It helps in clandestine operations and targeted assassinations. So in that way, it carries out insurrection activities and activities of regional destabilization in the Middle East and elsewhere. So in a much more practical and concrete way, it's an organization that was involved in terrorist activities for a long time. In Latin America, my colleague reminded us, it was involved in recent terrorist activities in Europe as well, targeted attacks, targeted assassinations on European ground. And in terms of terrorist attacks, of 100 million of the Hamas budget comes from the money of the Iranians and through the IRGC. So all these elements make us see that it is a terrorist organization, despite the fact that it's not a non-state actor. I would bring back several points. So to list this group in the terrorist category does not prevent us from taking other means. It's not a choice of one or the other. Listing it does not exclude other approaches. The IRGC is not the greatest threat to us, but to know that these Revolutionary Guards are working more and more closely with Russia and China and other countries from the Cooperation Association of Shanghai that are menaces for us, puts them in that category. And I'll come back on what Mahmoud Amiri Moghadam said. To compare them with the Nazis and the SS is not exaggerating. There is a parallel there that's very relevant. And the considerations raised by Canada, the reasons to not put them in this list of terrorist organizations seem to be specious arguments. The idea that it could really threaten our diplomatic relationship with Iran doesn't hold any truth. The fact that it could be a problem for the Canadians of Iranian origin does not hold water. Several of my compatriots here have been the object of their activities on here, and that it could...
Over time, if you could wrap up your comments in the next 15 to 20 seconds.
Sure, definitely. Et l'idée que ça pourrait poser...
And the idea that it might pose challenges at the administrative or legal level because we don't have the means to do it, I'm sorry, but that's really an argument that makes me despair. So I will end on this. Thank you.
Much, Professor Pahlavi. Now we turn to the members for questions. And the first member is MP Landsman. You have 6 minutes. So we will only have one round for each party, and it will consist of 6 minutes. Thank you.
Sure, I'll split my time with my colleague here, but I want to start with Professor Pahlavi. I want to know what your thoughts are, given your response to I think to another testimony about whether you think Canada is naive for their, frankly, slow nature in not listing or refusal to list the IRGC, which you clearly agree with.
Professor Pahlavi? Yes. Professor Pahlavi, you're muted. If you can unmute yourself. Thank you.
Yep. Oui, j'abonderai.
Yes, I agree with that comment. Canada in the international community seems naive and not wanting to act in this situation. And the idea that we're not affected by what's happening in Iran is a mistake and a moral problem.
And what do you believe that it will do for the diaspora community here to know that calling a terrorist would maybe help? Or the second question, actually, is what do you think it will do to our international standing with some of those who I think have been putting pressure on us to act more vigorously when it comes to calling a terrorist a terrorist?
Alors, je dirais que ce serait une décision qui...
So I would say that that would be a decision.
Some of us are not getting translation. Can we double check, please?
Dr. Fry will look right into it.
This is the interpreter speaking. on the English Channel. You can hear the interpreter? Oh, okay. Well.
Okay. So let's see. Maybe it'll work now. Thanks.
Okay, sorry about that, Professor Pahlavi. Please do proceed.
Alors, je dirais que si
So I would say that if Canada were to take the decision to list the IRGC on the international list of terrorists, it would be perceived very positively by many of our compatriots of Iranian origin living here in Canada. And this would most certainly contribute to a better perception of Canada. The Americans have already placed this group on the list, and I think we would seem much more serious if we decided to do it.
Thank you. Thanks to this. Dr. Juno, you said that Canada doesn't have or doesn't do enough to combat IRGC. We know that, it's no secret, there's all this money laundering operation in Canada, IRGC, Hezbollah, the Hells Angels. There's car dealerships are owned in Ontario by these groups. The cars thefts in Canada and exports to overseas. This is another act of money laundering is happening every day. Real estate, however, retail, money exchange, all these operations are obvious there. And we're still not doing anything about it. It's hurting the Canadian economy more than anything and the Canadian people. The safety, the security, the inflation, it's hurting everywhere. Why, in your opinion, why we're not doing anything about that? Why?
Why is hard for me to say. I would say that in general, Canada does not do enough on the national security front. I think that's true in general on multiple threats that we face today, and it's definitely true on the issue of Iran and the IRGC, as I think I emphatically said in my presentation. To me, my whole point is that the best way to counter IRGC activities here, including the ones that you described, as well as multiple others, and I would really emphasize the transnational repression aspect against dissidents and human rights activists here. The most effective way to do that is targeted measures and using some of the tools at our disposal. It's very easy to dismiss concerns about resources, scarce resources, as despairing, but in the real world, resource constraints are real, and they prevent us from doing things that we should be doing. These resource constraints are absolutely severe. Therefore, I think targeted measures would be much more effective. Same thing on the issue of reputation. What hurts our reputation the most is not listing the IRGC. What hurts our reputation the most is the fact that we announce measures and don't actually enforce them, which would be the case with listing the IRGC, realistically.
So the answer is listing IRGC as a terrorist organization in Canada is the only way and the most effective way to combat this. Otherwise, we're going to continue watching the same organization hurting and attacking Canadians' lives and the security and safety of Canadians every day. Is that correct?
That is not my position. My argument is that the most effective way is to use more targeted and surgical tools that we have at our disposal. That would be more effective and more resource effective.
Are you suggesting another infrastructure?
Nope.
You still have 35 seconds.
35 seconds. So to go back to the infrastructure, how severe the infrastructure of IRGC in Canada, in your opinion?
As I emphasized in my presentation, the IRGC threat to Iranian Canadians and to other aspects of Canadian society and life is a severe threat, absolutely.
The amount of money laundering that you think they're involved in, any idea if there any estimation out there?
I have never seen a number in the public domain. I think there's a big problem, notably with the parking of financial assets, but I don't have a number.
If anyone to estimate the number of members involved here, in hundreds or in thousands?
You mean members of the IRGC?
Yes.
Again, in the public domain, I have not seen numbers at that level, so I'm not in a position to answer that specifically, beyond saying that it's a serious problem.
Thank you very much, Mr. Abel Taif. We now turn to Dr. Fry. Dr. Fry, you have 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, but I will share my time with Samir. Thank you. I think you make a lot of sense, but it's not only that we do not have the resources because to deal with sanctions against Russia, to deal with all of the other issues we have to deal with in terms of security. Security has become globally rampant, or the lack of security, because we see that we're having problems, including with Iran, when they are also the ones who are helping Russia, and therefore any sanctions we've applied against Russia is not working very well. We've seen that. So how do we deal with the IRGC and its activities in Canada, given that they're not going to apply to come to Canada saying, I belong to this group. They're going to come in under some kind of other heading. And how do we know? How do we flush them out? That's the first thing. If we're going to apply sanctions against them in Canada to protect our own Canadian Iranians, how do we do that? Because it's like trying to tie down a sort of slippery fish. How do you do it? That's the first thing. The second thing is, how many of the other countries like Hezbollah, etc., that are helping them, and how do we deal with their influence out there as well? Those are two questions. Thanks. I won't ask any more. Samir will probably ask others. Just could I get answers to those two questions? It's one thing to say, let's apply sanctions. It's another thing to say how, because so many rogue nations are helping to block sanctions. Okay, somebody start.
Is that a question to me?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. How to, act on the ground? I think that it's hard to say that in 1 minute, but I think our two main tools are tools that, if we better use them, can be quite effective. The Special Economic Measures Act, which allows us to list individuals and entities and impose a number of sanctions on them, including financial sanctions and so on. That can be quite effective if properly enforced, which is not the case at this point. And the other tool that the current government brought in about a year and a half ago, if I'm not mistaken, is through the use of the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, which allows to bar from entry and impose a number of additional sanctions to a number of officials within the regime, i.e. not only the IRGC. I think it's difficult to assess properly what the success of that has been so far, because there's very little publicly available data, but it is, to my mind, a tool that we can also use. The other aspect of your question, which is partners of Iran, I think that's an important question. Hezbollah in particular has a number of financial networks that are involved here in Canada, but also throughout the world, in parts of West Africa, of South America, very extensive. And I do think that Canada can do more to counter these financial networks here. And beyond the issue of these financial networks, one thing that Iran has done a lot in recent years, notably with the Houthis in Yemen, is to build an extensive global network of smuggling to send weapons parts of missiles, parts of drones to Yemen in particular, but to Hezbollah, to Hamas. The U.S. is leading efforts to counter these networks, and I do think that Canada could play a stronger role, for example, in the Red Sea, to participate in multilateral efforts to counter these smuggling networks.
Mr. Pavlovi, your hand was up.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Fry, for this question. Je dirais que
I would say that what characterizes the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, it's a threat that has many shapes, multi-facets at 360 degrees. These people are involved in activities in cyberspace, in the ballistic program, in the nuclear program, in smuggling of parts. They're present in Sudan and Latin America. They work in Central Asia. They work in the Caucasus. They have their hand in plenty of different files. And so to answer your question, the good approach for approaching this phenomenon that is has so many shapes, it's to act in a similar way that's multifaceted. I agree with Dr. Juneau about a targeted approach, but that does not prevent supplementing it with other means. The Revolutionary Guards are a ideological and a political army, and to list them in the category of terrorist organizations is to respond in kind to the phenomenon. It's complementing the approach by various means and attack them in a systematic way.
Samir, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And in the 45 seconds that remains to Mr. Juneau, if you can, or Dr. Juneau, can you just briefly elaborate upon the GCC and the IRGC Iran, the dynamics between these two broad groups in the 30 seconds or so?
In 30 seconds. My view is a fairly cynical one in the sense that it's an inherently conflictual relationship, notwithstanding a more positive tone in relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran in the last 2 years, roughly since a rapprochement that was sort of brokered by China. They remain adversaries. Tension remains beneath the surface, and any talk of further reconciliation between Saudi Arabia and Iran in particular, to me, is very unlikely.
Thank you, Professor Juneau. We now go to MP Bergeron. You have 6 minutes, sir.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. My questions will be for Dr. Pahlavi. First of all, I quite agree with your statement to say that you can't chew gum and walk at the same time, or not do that. We want to use all the tools that are available to us to fight against the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps. And if we have to invest more resources in terms of the list of terrorist entities, which to you corresponds to the criteria respond to the IRGC, and as Professor Juneau said, we can add more for application of the special economic regime, special economic measures. Until now, very little funds were frozen. We're talking about maybe $79,000 that were frozen in the context of the rule on special economic measures related to Iran. So we could add resources on that side as well. One thing that you said that struck me was that, in your opinion, the South thinks that Canada is rather complacent in terms of the Iranian regime and of the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps. So that should bring us, in your opinion, to list this entity on the list of terrorist groups. Last week we received Professor Raboudi from the University of Ottawa, who also said that the IRGC, in his opinion, corresponded to the definition of terrorism, but that it wasn't appropriate at this point for a question of credibility on the international scene, given the Middle East conflict currently, to do this now. So that would, in his opinion, discredit us. Well, I'm interpreting what he said. I don't want to put words in his mouth, but to discredit ourselves in the eyes of the international community, and especially of the global South. What do you think of that analysis that goes against what you were saying? Thank you for your question. So I think I understand the reasoning behind his statement. It's quite conjectural. And he says that in the context of the Gaza war and the situation there, that to list the IRGC on that list at this point would put us in the group of pro-Israel countries, which could tarnish us in the eyes of some public opinion internationally. I think that's why he's been saying that. I would counter that there is no good moment to put an organization that can be compared to a fascist organization on such a list. It's true that maybe there might be a bit of a price to pay there at the diplomatic level in terms of our international image. But it would be time for Canada to stop being cautious and trying to be circumspect. Sometimes you have to take action. Earlier, we were surprised to see the Houthis attack ships crossing the Red Sea. To your mind, what was their goal, given that the Houthis are the target of an attack or attacks coming from an international coalition? What was their goal? To broaden that international coalition, or was Iran's goal was to destabilize international trade? Well, here we're in Dr. Junot's field. I'll let him complete what I will say. And I think that, yes, you're right. The Iranian activities in general respond to a clear principle. It's to create disturbance and destabilize the activities of propaganda, what they're doing in Lebanon, what they're doing in Yemen. And you know that the IRGCs are even more active with the Al-Quds force in Sudan, where they're delivering using Ashari 36 drones to the army of a general whose name I've forgotten, but whose goal is to place one foot on both sides of the Strait of Bab el and the Red Sea and to destabilize or not be able to interrupt global maritime traffic. So briefly, you said it clearly. The threat posed by the Houthis in the Red Sea is very serious, and it's there for the long term. And it's a threat that is a direct result of the Iranian aid to Houthis, the capacities that the Houthis use in the Red Sea, the drones, the underwater drones, the amphibious boats, the naval mines. In great majority, they come from Iran. Without Iran, the Houthis would not have this capacity. The Houthis' goal is to emerge as the internationally recognized government in Yemen, which is not the case. There's another government that's recognized by the international community. But the problem is that government is weak, fragmented, and corrupt. And the Houthis have, it's bad news, de facto, they won the civil war in Yemen. And nowadays the U.S., despite their efforts to counter these attacks in the Red Sea, have a very limited number of choices to counter them. So I'll stop about that. So it's a threat in the Red Sea that we need to, will be facing for the long term. Thank you.
MP McPherson, you have 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you for our witnesses for being here today and sharing this with us. Professor Junot, you just spoke about the Houthis, and you talked about how the U.S. has very little control in the region. I'm concerned, as a parliamentarian for Canada, what Canada should be doing to counter Iran's influence in the area, given the horrifying humanitarian situation, the suffering of Yemenis under both the Houthis as well as the Saudi war, which was, of course, we know, supported politically by Canada, the desperate need for real peace and a real diplomatic solution. What can we do in this case that would benefit the people of Yemen, who we know have suffered so greatly at the hands of both warring parties?
Thank you. Just to build on what I said in answer to the previous question, the reality right now is that the Houthis have won the civil war in Yemen. They do not control the entire territory of the country, but they control about 60 to 70% of the population. And politically and militarily, they are by far the strongest actor in the country. That is very bad news for the people of Yemen, because the Houthis have shown to be absolutely brutal in terms of their administration. And it's bad news for the region, because now they are exporting that brutality outside the borders of Yemen. We suspected that for years, but now we actually see it in terms of what they're doing in the Red Sea. And the problem is that that is not going to stop. A ceasefire in Gaza, for example, is a separate discussion, but it is not going to stop the Houthi threat to the Red Sea. It is independent of that. So from a Canadian perspective, I think we need to support U.S. efforts to counter the Houthis, because that is good for regional security, and ultimately it is good for the Yemeni people. How do we do that? Participating in the maritime mission in the Red Sea. Even if it's a symbolic participation as it is now, it's better than nothing. If ever we have a ship to spare, which is not obvious, then I think that would be a good idea. Beyond that, there's just not much of a political process in Yemen right now because the Houthis are not interested in it.
Yeah, and I suppose, having a feminist foreign policy or purported to have a feminist foreign policy means that we should be looking at ways that we can end the impact on women and children, which we know are the ones that are feeling the brunt of this conflict the most. Speaking of our foreign policy, one of the things that you spoke about was the fact that Canada has a reputational risk because we are not following through on what we promise. So we say one thing, but we don't follow through on that. That's been the problem with using sanctions as a cornerstone or as a large piece of our foreign policy, is that we have no ability to enforce those. We're known as being quite good at putting people on the list or putting entities on the list, but the follow-through and the enforcement of those sanctions is of course, very weak. You mentioned that there is significant harms to Canada's reputation, or potential significant harms to Canada's reputation from this. Can you describe that a little bit more for me?
That's an extremely important point, and I think that in general in Canada, civil society, media, political level, we really underestimate the damage to our reputation of being free riders or easy riders on defense and national security issues, of underinvesting in these issues. It's true for sanctions, as I said, but it's absolutely true beyond sanctions. Whether there's a reputational risk in the global south, to be perfectly blunt, I'm not especially bothered by that. There's a significant reputational risk with our allies in NATO and especially in the US, and that's what should really bother us. Especially because as the 2020s and the 2030s go by, more and more multilateralism, on which we are so dependent, is about what you bring to the table. It's not about your reputation as a do-gooder or anything like that. And what we bring to the table is limited. And more we are not going to be invited to ad hoc multilateral arrangements. Think about the AUKUS working groups, for example, and multiple other examples. So whether it's sanctions or something else, we need to be much more coherent and consistent at this level. Well,
and one would think, too, that the fact that our reputation is weak with regards to sanctions and other areas within the multilateral fora, also the idea that we are sort of backpacking on our reputation that was perhaps something that we had from some time ago. I mean, we are losing that reputation as well as being, as you put it, do-gooders in the global community. We've seen that we have not been very coherent with regards to support for international law. We have not been very coherent with regards to support for trade and Canadian impacts of Canadian companies working abroad. So there's been a number of times where our foreign policy has not aligned with the actions that we do on the world stage, and of course we will see the impacts of that as we go forward. So one of the things you talked about was not having enough resources dedicated to things like sanction enforcement, that we have not added those resources. Can you talk a little bit more about what it could look like and what other countries are doing with regards to ensuring that these things are adequately resourced and given the tools necessary to do the job?
Well, the first thing I would say is the last point I mentioned in my presentation first, which is the need for more transparency at this level. Generally speaking, we are not very good at transparency on the national security, foreign policy front, and that goes on the sanctions side. So I am not in a position to give any numbers to quantify my answer. This is based on research and conversations and interviews and informal parts of my work on a regular basis, and also as a former government person. In a nutshell, whether it's CSIS, the RCMP, CBSA, and also foreign affairs, global affairs, which plays a major role now in terms of coordinating these issues, the international trade side of foreign affairs, there is very simply a need for more resources, more human bodies, and more money. If you look at OFAC, the Office of Foreign Assets Control, which is the U.S. office that manages sanctions in the U.S., it is gigantic. We are not the U.S., and we never will be, but proportionately, we are nowhere close.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. That's good for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, MP McPherson. Given that we have a few minutes left, I'm going to ask two questions. First of all, Professor Junot, I completely understand the arguments you've been making regarding resource management, and that's fair enough. But what concerns me is I have not seen us do anything concrete to deal with all of the activities the members were asking you about, whether it's money laundering, whether it's transnational repression. There's been very, very little concrete action. What is the risk of that? Does that not embolden the Islamic Republic and the IRGC as well?
Well, the simple answer to that is yes. And this is something that I and a number of my colleagues have been saying for years now, that we have been neglecting national security issues. The IRGC is in that list of threat that we have been neglecting, but it is far from the only one. Look at the whole debate on foreign interference that is going on right now. I would bring you, for example, to your attention the report that a number of my colleagues and I did at the University of Ottawa 2 years ago, a task force that had a number of former directors of CSIS, former national security advisors, former deputy ministers of defense and foreign affairs, and the bulk of that report was a call to action on the costs of neglecting all of these threats, which included the IRGC, but that was only one of the many, many threats we highlighted: cyber, economic espionage, money laundering, terrorism, extremism, China, Russia, India, and so on.
Thank you very much. And last question to Professor Pahlavi. As you know, our authorities work hand in glove with our American counterparts, especially when it comes to law enforcement. Have you had an opportunity to discuss the concerns that you expressed with U.S. authorities, and what is their perspective, given the reality that they have already listed the IRGC?
Merci pour cette question. Non, malheureusement, je n'ai.
Thank you for this question. Unfortunately, I didn't have the opportunity to discuss this with the American government authorities. However, I've often discussed with representatives of the American Armed Forces on a candid and informal basis, and they're always surprised by the absence of a clear strategic line in the Canadian policy. And this is something that's necessary to have a consistent policy, including in terms of the IRGC. And to use an example about our reputation, the use of our resources, the example I spoke about earlier, the activities of the IRGC support in Sudan, there's a civil war raging. There's 8 million displaced people and many, many deaths. And we still don't have an envoy there or an African policy. The Revolutionary Guards are creating a base in Port Sudan, which faces Yemen directly, and are subsidizing a naval base being built in Djibouti. So there are some actors that are lucid, others who are naive, and I'm afraid we're part of this latter group.
Very much, Professor Pahlavi. That concludes questions by the members. At this point, I'd like to thank Professor Amiri Moghadam, Professor Pahlavi, and of course, Professor Junot. Very, very grateful for your time and your expertise. Now, before all the members leave, I just wanted to talk about the budget that was sent around to you, the budget for the study of the appointment of Dr. Bennett as Canada's ambassador to Denmark. The amount was $1,000, which was circulated to you. Is it the pleasure of the committee to adopt that budget? Yes, excellent. And then there's the S-tier budget, a budget for the study of the current situation in Ethiopia in the amount of $6,800 for the subcommittee on international human rights. Is it the pleasure of the committee to adopt that budget? And finally, a budget for the study of the current situation in Sudan in the amount of $6,750 for the subcommittee. Is it the pleasure of the committee to adopt that budget as well? Excellent. Thank you very, very much. Meeting adjourned. Yes, ma'am.
Sign here, please.